If you had opened a newspaper in New York City in the 1890s, you wouldn't have found calm. You would have found shouting. Headlines screamed, stories bled, facts bent. Papers were openly partisan, openly sensational, openly emotional. William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer were locked in a circulation war that rewarded outrage and spectacle. The louder the paper, the bigger the audience. And the people were exhausted. So in 1896, something happened quietly at first. A publisher named Adolph Ochs took over a struggling newspaper called the New York Times. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't dominant, but Ochs made a wager that seemed almost naive at the time. He promised to publish the news without fear or favor. He printed a simple motto: all the news that's fit to print. It wasn't neutral because it was timid. It certainly wasn't timid. It was restrained because restraint had become, radical. Ochs's vision was a direct departure from the sensationalism of the era. It was an attempt to restore credibility and seriousness in a chaotic media environment. And slowly, improbably, it worked. The Times didn't win by shouting louder. It won by breathing again. And then the calendar flipped, the presses slowed, the shouting faded, and really for a century, the public learned what it sounds like when a paper or a news organization can speak in a normal human voice. The press became responsible, and trusted voices arose like Walter Cronkite and Barbara Walters. The Washington Post, which was bankrupted with its embrace of sensationalism, was brought back to prominence in the 30s when it embraced responsible journalism. News outlets were held in high regard, and they were even called the Fourth Estate in the first draft of history. News was seen as a window to the world. And that's the part of the story that we romanticize: the tired public, the weary media landscape, and a newsroom that decides almost stubbornly to become reassuring. But history doesn't stop, it rhymes. And here we are again in a world of media chaos. Only now the shouting doesn't come from ink and paper. It comes from clicks and posts and viral videos, from feeds and influencers. It comes from this new architecture of our attention. You can feel it if you scroll for 30 seconds. The modern newsstand is a feed. The headline is a thumbnail, and the loudest voice wins, not really because it's the wisest, but because the system is built to reward velocity and reaction. So just as the yellow journalism of the past searched for the most sensational stories to grab the attention of the passerby, the feeds fill with fancy and frustration fixed on finding ways to grab your attention. And everyone has chosen sides. Fear sells, and the algorithms push their dopamine through segmentation. You get what you click, and more, you become what you click. We're living in a media environment that doesn't merely report reality, it trains us how to experience it. And into that environment steps the new street corner broadcasters. Independent, viral, partisan, and sometimes genuinely investigative, always optimized for the audience that shares them. So over Christmas weekend, for example, YouTuber Nick Shirley went viral with a video alleging fraud tied to Minnesota daycare programs. His footage-driven, on-the-ground content was an immediate catalytic to the political bloodstream. Axios described how the video ricocheted through the conservative networks and even drew public response from national figures. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you can find a parallel ecosystem. Progressive investigative startups, creator-driven outlets that position themselves as alternatives to the mainstream gatekeepers. Jordan Sheridan's Status Coup, for example, explicitly brands itself as independent on-the-ground reporting. Mehdi Hasan's Zedio launched with the promise of opinionated, hard-hitting journalism across video, podcast, and newsletter, explicitly refusing the old pretense that news can be value-free, while still claiming allegiance to truth-telling. These show how the reporter role is being reinvented as a kind of narrative witness. You don't have to approve of this to recognize what they represent. Journalism has become unbundled. Authority has become desegregated into platforms, personalities, cliques, and tribes. And the people are exhausted again. Not because there's too little information, but because there's too much stimulation, too much certainty, too much performance masquerading as reporting, too many voices yelling, "Trust me," when the ground beneath trust keeps shifting. And that's the ecology we live in. So now the question is, what does a legacy institution do when the entire environment has changed? And that's where the Washington Post re-enters the story. In 2017, after Bezos bought the historic news outlet, the Post placed a phrase beneath its masthead that kind of reads like a warning: "Democracy dies in darkness." The slogan's adoption drew immediate attention. Accounts of its rollout and attribution, including its association with Bob Woodward, have been widely discussed. That line does something important. It doesn't merely announce a brand, it announces a posture. We illuminate, we investigate, we insist that power be seen. And then, quietly internally, the Post added another phrase: riveting storytelling for all of America. Reporting about the internal mission statement framed it as a rallying point for the newsroom and as a part of a broader attempt to expand reach and relevance for all of America. Radical. Their new slogan, "Democracy dies in darkness," feels like a recasting of Ox's "Without Fear," and riveting storytelling for all of America, a narrative version of "Without Favor." For all, not just one or the other. Now, if you're tempted to say, "Aha, this is the Post trying to become the New Times of 1896, you have to be careful. The parallel's real, but it isn't a clean mirror. Ox was counter-programming sensationalism with restraint. The Post is navigating something different. A world where attention is algorithmically sorted and where audiences are fragmented into micropublics and where trust is constantly contested. So the Post's problem isn't simply partisanship, it's legibility. How do you speak in a way that reaches all of America without dissolving into blandness? How do you pursue moral clarity, democracy dies in darkness, without just becoming another combatant in a culture that treats every story like a team sport? In the late 1800s, the competition was Hearst and Pulitzer. In the 2020s, the competition is the partisan feed. It's the thumbnail, the influencer, the independent investigator, the streamer, the clip, the hot take, the algorithm, and now looming behind all of it, AI systems that can generate infinite plausible texts at an infinite scale. And that's why the Post's two phrases matter as metaphor. Democracy dies in darkness is a lantern. Riveting storytelling for all of America is a bridge. One says we fearlessly expose what's hidden. The other says we must be heard by people who no longer share a single perspective or public square. That's not hypocrisy, that's the tension of modern journalism. The obligation to illuminate and the necessity to reach, which brings us back to 1896 and the wager Ox made. He bet that credibility could outlast noise. And here's the question that would have made sense then and makes sense now. What does "Without Fear or Favor" look like in an age when the medium itself is built to favor fear? And if the public is exhausted again, exhausted by chaos, exhausted by shouting, by the sensation that everything is propaganda, what kind of journalism will help us breathe again? That question feels very Washington Post. Thank you.